Are there any other, so yeah, that's quite useful what you've told me. You've addressed both mitigation works and you've talked about traffic volumes. Is there anything else you'd like to comment on in response to questions of traffic witnesses on the various aspects, or do you think you've covered that?
I think I've covered everything. In terms of our assessment, we were sort of focused on the shorter term. So I haven't done a lot of work into future year traffic modelling, etc.
No.
But from my point of view, just looking at the short term, the year one,
yes,
the mitigation works on Friendship Place are required, and the mitigation works on Kapiti Road are required.
Okay. And it's probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you see any sort of showstoppers in developing some mitigation on Kapiti Road? You know, the road reserve area, even if traffic volumes are higher than have been projected, do you think that it's something that could be designed?
I heard what Mr. Carr said in relation to this question, and I've got the same opinion as him. I think it's probably going to work. I just haven't seen a plan that demonstrates 100% that it is. So,
all right. That's okay.
And I guess the other concern I've got is I presume the additional lane that they will be providing is a left turn lane into the countdown site.
Yes.
I'm not sure because I haven't seen a plan, but I assume that's what they will do. But then I'd like to see that it's an appropriate design. I wouldn't want to see what they've done for Friendship Place put onto Kapiti Road.
All right. And okay, just finally on that Friendship Place length of the lane, Mr. Kelly's saying it's not necessary to mitigate the effects of what's proposed now with this proposal, but you maintain it is necessary from a safety point of view, etc. Is that right?
This is the additional lane on Kapiti Road.
No, the left turn lane being extended in length on the roundabout.
I personally, I do road safety audits. And if I was given this for a road safety audit, I would say that it would likely have a minor effect, which is in a road safety audit, there's various sort of categories that you put things in. Significant and serious effects you have to address, but a minor concern you don't. So in this case, I'd bring it up as a concern, but it likely, I can't predict what another safety auditor would say, but probably it could get through the safety audit with the design they have now. I just expressed the concern that there's a risk there that if a safety auditor did say that they wanted that lane lengthened, you enter a potential stalemate situation.
Yeah, okay. No, that's probably as far as I can take you on that one, but thank you for the response.
Yeah.
All right. Look, I don't think I've got any further questions at this stage, but we'll see what transpires at the end of the hearing. Might need your input again.
Okay. Thank you
very much. Cheers. All right.
Thank you, Commissioner. So that's the evidence of the submitters. The only other point I thought I'd make is that when we were having that discussion earlier about New Zealand king salmon and the adaptive management and precautionary principle, it appears to me that there is one other distinction, if you like, between that scenario and this scenario, which is the impact of a direct impact on a third party. So in a king salmon scenario with adaptive management, what you're talking about is the impact on the environment generally. Here, what you're talking about is the impact directly on an existing third party and their operations. So again, it's another distinction that in my submission counts against this being appropriate to deal with an adaptive management regime and more appropriate to deal with those direct impacts on a third party now as part of this assessment rather than deal with it later.
Okay, in case it becomes important, I invite you, Mr. Quinn, to please send me a note on that. Yes. Because I think it's, you certainly touched on it, and I'd like to, for you to write down those extra points you made, additional points you made about that applicability of king salmon. I think that is useful. So if you're able to do that at some stage, that'd be useful. Thank you. Yes,
I will. And I see that amazingly, from a timing perspective, we're just ahead of your scheduled time.
Yeah, it's funny how it works out. But what we'll do then, I think that's the case of all the submitters, unless I've missed something, in which case we'll take a break and then we'll take the council team next. And then we'll see where we head to from there. So if we take a break and come back at 22:04, is it? Yeah, 3:40, and we'll then take council officers, reporting officers. Thank you.
Commissioner, can I just ask through you for Mr.
Yep.
Mr. Leakey, if you could turn his phone on, I'd like to give him a ring.
Okay. Yep. There you go. We've heard that.
That's right, and I've also unmuted. I think, sir, I assume you meant 2:40, not 3.
Oh, sorry, I've got the wrong. Look at 1 minute. Yeah, 2:40. We don't need quite that long. No, 2:40. We'll come back. Yep. Thanks for correcting that. All right. All right, everyone, we're back in business. Thank you. Resume the hearing with council officers. Are you both, Neil and Marnie, I see are in attendance? Yep. So if you're able to unmute and come on the screen, that'd be great. Thanks. Now, right, can you both hear me, Marnie, Ms. Ryden? Yep, you're there, okay. I've got a few questions of the 42A report that I'll put to you first of all, and then invite you to respond to any matters that you've heard during the hearing, and I'll do the same for Mr. Trotter. And a lot of the questions I had of you have already been addressed and answered, so the list has been reduced somewhat, you'll be pleased to know. So that's good. We've talked about the designation, that's been clarified. I just had, the first question I had was paragraph 18, I think it is, of your report. And these are, some of these are quite minor matters, but I just needed to get it clarified. Hours of operation for business activities that do not adjoin or face the residential zones are not limited. I was just wondering whether the wider site, the site that is the application site, which is wider than just the area that's being developed, it does adjoin a residential zone, does it not? Or at least it's right next to some housing areas at the back. So I'm just wondering whether...
Yes, it does. It does adjoin a residential zone. I believe it's Dennis Taylor Court right over the back of the site. Okay,
so so does that, strictly speaking, does it trigger another rule requirement there or breach of rules, do you think?
I don't believe it does, because I believe the wording used, which is referenced in the report, is in the 42A report, is the activity rather than the site. Oh
yes, okay. The activity, yes. No, like that.
Between the two.
That's fair. I didn't ask Ms. Panther-Knight that question, but I think you've clarified that one. Thank you. All right. Now the next question I had was paragraph 31, which was officers. The way that officers have been assessed, and have you reflected on whether you still maintain that the officers are a separate standalone activity that require consent?
So, as a permitted activity in the general residential zone under Rule 8, they're provided as a permitted activity ancillary to industrial activities on the site, and then limited in terms of what size they could be. And then it leads into a restricted discretionary activity around officers. Looking at the definitions of officers and retail activities, I think it probably does, but overall, on the whole, it doesn't change anything.
No, okay.
In the assessment or anything like that, but my view certainly would be that yes, it would need consent for that element, but it's not.
It may not be. Yeah. Okay. All right. I don't think the applicant are contesting it strongly. So I think if we're to be conservative, we would include it unless we hear to the contrary. Okay. Thank you. Right. 55. I was just curious about paragraph 55, the first two bullet points. The first bullet point says it places the supermarket and trade buildings closer to the back of the site. And then the next bullet point says it brings forward well-designed modern buildings towards Kapiti Road. I think so the buildings are going further back on this. The new buildings would be further back on the site, but they're providing more of a facade to the street. Is that the point you're making there?
So those were quotes that have been taken from Mr. Knox.
Oh, okay. I should have asked him.
Urban design assessment. Sorry, the footnote for that is right at the end of the last bullet point in 55.
Yes.
It's come from Mr. Knox, urban design
Well,
assessment.
I should have asked him, but I think I understand that the buildings are going further back, but they provide more of a facade to the street. Yeah, I think that's
yes, with the glazing and open, it's typically windows along the front.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'll just find it 6.5. 65, paragraph 65, the infrastructure report, which I had no questions on. I was just going to ask, did council do an internal peer review of that? Did any council officers review that and comment to you?
Yes, so that was part of what our development engineers looked at when they reviewed the application, and they didn't raise any concerns.
Okay, thank you.
Around that.
Thank you. Right. Did iwi require any further consultation? I know you've recommended some conditions to deal with the concerns they raised, but was there any expectation on their part that you're aware of that they wanted to be involved in conditions any further, or was that the end of it from their point of view?
No, from my point of view, with the information that we've received from them, was that was the
end of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. That was 6.9. I should have mentioned section 6.9 and 7.1. Yep. So you referred to the national policy statement. That's fine. I understood those points. We also heard a little bit today about the MDRS, or the medium density legislation, which could potentially lead to more intensification and growth and so forth. Was that something that you thought was relevant, or is that another matter I should take into account?
I think relating to that, I think certainly to some extent the effects of that on the coast and potential uptake of those standards is unknown at this stage. And I think the effects from that in terms of growth should probably fall to wider council growth assessments than on this particular applicant.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then 119. Sorry, I'm speaking to it. Yeah, I was just going to ask in relation to the earthworks will mitigate the ponding flood hazard with respect to, there's mention of the floodwaters in a 1% AEP event. My question was simply, is that a standard used by council? Is it a standard sort of that's now used by council? It's 1%, as far as you're aware? Yeah, okay, so there's just the normal way it's approached, you look at 1%. Okay, I'm not challenging, I'm just sort of making sure I understand what arrived at. Okay, thank you. Right, 128. Paragraph 128. A number of signs are located within the site itself. Are there some that aren't on the site? Are there some out on road reserve? Are there?
I guess talking about when they're in the site themselves, there's non-compliances. I think it was with the electrical signs for the pickup area and things like that for the online orders and deliveries.
Okay.
So they're well set back from that road frontage, but all the signs, are within the actual site. It's just that what is visible from the road is not necessarily some of those smaller ones that do require consent, but are not visible until you're actually well within that car park area.
Oh, they're very internal. Okay, all right,
Yes.
understand that. All right, and we had I've had a lot of discussion about the objectives and policies, and I understand your evidence in relation to that, and ask Ms. Panther Knight about that as well. So I have no particular questions other than just to I guess wrap up your assessment about the gateway tests. Does it pass those, the gateway tests?
I believe so, yes.
Yep, I'm just not sure you've said that, but I think in answer to, in the council's response evidence, if you like, with conditions, you've also mentioned that you're satisfied that part 2 is met, I think. So it's pretty clear you're recommending approval based on all of those things. Okay. All right. And finally, you've attached a list of consents that have been granted in the general area as Appendix A. I haven't gone through that, but is there anything in there that I should be particularly aware of, in your view?
I guess based on what's been discussed today, of particular relevance are the consents that relate to the airport site itself.
Right.
And because there's so many of them, I went back, I think, as far as 2010, just because that was a significant amount of consents. Since the application for the supermarket has been lodged, we did receive and approve a resource consent. It's not directly, it's a property known as One Lodestar Place for earthworks, the relocation of a building and a market that they wanted to hold on Saturdays that didn't meet various conditions, and that was granted in January this year.
I see. So there's nothing particularly relevant about that one or any of the others, other than the Mitre, I don't know if the Mitre 10 one appears on that list, but I've heard about developments within the Kapiti landing site, but there's no other adjacent ones that are relevant particularly.
No, so the only other one that going through these records has not either been given effect to or lapsed or as a subdivision consent would be the extension to the Mitre 10 consent that was granted back in 2019.
All right. No, look, thank you for that. So I've got no further questions of the report, and just before I ask you to respond to anything that you've heard during the hearing, in terms of the draft conditions, you would have heard the questions and responses to the landscape condition 13, and Ms. Panther Knight's going to do some more work on that. Have you got any comments to make on that, on condition 13?
I think to some extent, and probably maybe it could be clearer, and so we're happy to review additional wording from Ms. Panther Knight on that, is that bullet points 8 and 9 do mention both implementation and scheduling.
Oh, okay. In conditions 8 and 9, is that right?
So condition 13, bullet points 8.
Bullet points, okay. 1, 2, 3.
So I think they're sort of the last.
Yeah, that's right. That requires an implementation plan, but as I see it, there's still nothing that requires planting to actually be done. It's just a plan.
Okay. No, like I said, we're happy to.
Okay, that's right. I just wondered if you'll probably be asked to review the draft condition that's put forward at some stage. So if there's anything else you can suggest, by all means, pass it on. Right. I think you've amended condition 15. And in terms of the question I asked about bus stops, which are shown on that plan, on the master plan, if you like, the bus stops are shown there, and they're indicative probably because they have to get regional council approval. Do you feel that condition that requires that plan to be generally in accordance with that plan is sufficient to ensure that those bus stops are put in place? Is that sufficient, do you think?
We, I guess, tended towards, in the drafting of the conditions and discussing with Mr. Trotter around the bus stops, because it required that third-party approval from the regional council, there was some reluctance to include a condition saying you have to have bus stops.
I see, yeah.
With the potential that then, you know, depending on what regional council thought and when those potentially would happen.
Yes, I see.
Not have that requirement in there, which is why it's.
That's a good point. Because okay. So if they
are there, but ultimately regional council plays a big part in that, so we wouldn't want to be putting it in.
All right, no, that's fine. I was just curious as to, you know, because I'm potentially in a position of imposing conditions of a grant consent, requiring bus stops when the regional council might say they're not going to allow them at all could frustrate the consent, you know. So that's a point I hadn't considered, so thank you for that. No, look, I think I've been through the conditions as they stand, and unless you've got any further comments on those conditions, I'll just ask you to respond. The normal way these hearings run is that the council officers have, you're the first ones to provide the evidence, and everyone's had a go at it, I guess, and now's your chance to respond to what you've heard and to either reinforce the points you've already made or to review those points and recommendations. And if you need more time to do that, I'm happy for you to do that. But if you have any comments to pass on now, happy to take them.
So just note in the discussion around the conditions that Ms. Panther-Knight was going to potentially provide some additional wording for condition 27, and we have around implementation, and we're happy to review that as well.
Okay.
Commissioner, you had made a comment around condition 14 with respect to the building consent side of things. And yes, overall that would play a part in the building consent process, but I think it was also something from the development engineers that's covered under this lovely document called the Subdivision and Development Principles and Requirements. And so that's sort of where that one came from, and obviously the applicants indicated that they're happy.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. I was
information requirement with no works really needed until the building consent if there is an issue.
Yes, that's right. I was more curious about it, but there's no argument, there's no resistance to that condition, so I'll leave it there. So yeah, I guess if I can sort of lead the discussion, I was interested in the principle of permitted development and, you know, controlled activity consents, and just whether you had any sort of observations on what traffic generation should be assumed from the adjoining land at Kapiti Landing, whether it's appropriate to leave the assessments of mitigation works as the applications are lodged later down the track, or whether this applicant at this time should take into account future growth in that centre, some of which may not be permitted. Did you have any sort of thoughts on what's reasonable to apply from a planning point of view to this hearing?
I consider that if it's an activity that needs a resource consent, whether that's controlled or not, that it, you know, that would not form part of any sort of permitted baseline. And I did want to touch on comments made by Mr. Goldsmith around the permitted residential activities within the airport zone and the airport mixed use precinct, because in full, the permitted activity standard relating to the mixed use precinct, which is R10 under the airport zone, talks about, so the actual standard itself says that they have to have obtained a subdivision for the residential activity, for then the residential activity as a land use to be permitted. So there's still a consent requirement in that regard.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So even residential development, if it requires subdivision, can't be assumed to be fully permitted. Is that what you're saying? Or did I misinterpret?
Something like that. I will provide you with the wording, because when I read it, I was a little bit like, okay, but it's basically saying that you can't have a residential activity as permitted. Yes. Unless you've got a subdivision consent already. But it also limits.
Oh, I see.
Yes. Of this residential activity. So I think that's important based on some of the plans and attachments that were included in Mr. Goldsmith's.
Okay, look, is there anything else you wanted to offer at this stage in terms of response to questioning about some of the matters we've talked about today? Because what I'm going to do is invite you to provide a written right of reply, so that the point you just made can be captured and you can express it how you wish, and that can be part of the officer's reply, and there'll be some traffic related matters too, I dare say. What I might do, Ms. Ryden, is direct you a little more in terms of the things I'm particularly interested in, and send a note through as to what I'd like addressed in particular from a planning point of view. But if there's anything else that I haven't touched on that you want to discuss now?
No, there's nothing else.
Okay.
I need to raise.
All right, well, we might leave it there then, and we'll see what transpires at the end of the hearing. So thank you. And Mr. Trotter, thanks for waiting patiently and listening to all the evidence. You're the fourth traffic engineer, the last one off the block, and you will have heard all the discussions, and there's been a lot of talk about modelling and traffic growth rates and council's plans and assumptions about roading links and all those sorts of things. rather than me go through your evidence and ask specific questions, is there anything you can sort of summarise that might help me understand any differences or defend, I guess, your assumptions you've made? The floor is yours on that.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to point out that the start by the section paragraph C on page 12, where I talk about the future connections. That was an error on my part, that I'd said all the connections were in place in 2026. That should have been 2026 and 2036. That the link through to Harker Street, as shown in figure 3.2, isn't in place in 2026. But what I was trying to show or explain in that section there was that there are future connections in place in the future in the model, and they're assumed, and that does have an overall effect on traffic volumes on Kapiti Road.
Yes.
So if you go back to page 4, where I'm outlining some of the figures from the model, they're daily numbers, but it just shows a total reduction between 2018 to 2036 in some scenarios, in some sections of the road. And it was just really trying to explain why that might be happening. And as Andy Carr said, you know, the model will redistribute traffic across the network on the basis of new links that are in place. And they might not be complete links that run parallel to Kapiti Road, but something's happening in the model that is having an effect. So I was just trying to draw out of the model why that might be happening, and just trying to explain that in that section. My analysis wasn't based on that of the effects, because really we focused in on the Saturday peak as being a critical point on the network, especially for a supermarket and retail. Yeah. The evening peak is important, but not so critical in terms of traffic generation from a supermarket. Adding to that Mr. Kelly had picked up growth from the traffic counts and applied positive growth to that period, when in the model we're seeing a daily negative growth on some sections. I thought that was probably the right course of action to take, to use the traffic counts and the growth from those traffic counts that Tim applied to his model, instead of relying on the Kapiti traffic model because of the future links that may or may not be in place.
Right.
Don't know if that clarifies or confuses.
I'm just trying to keep up with that. So the Saturn, Mr. Goldsmith said that the Saturn model was. Can you just clarify the difference between the Sidra and the Saturn model, and what, in particular, highlight which one showed the links that we've talked about? So the Saturn model, Saturn and Sidra, they're just software packages, different modeling packages that do different things. Yes. So the Saturn model is the Kapiti Traffic Model 4. That's the platform, the software. The platform that it's built off, but it's actually called Kapiti Traffic Model version 4, base year of 2018. The Sidra model is a bespoke model that was built by Tim Kelly for the purposes of assessing the traffic effects of this application of the resource consent. Right, and the links, the links have been built into the model that you've used.
Into the Saturn model, yes.
And that's what I've been told is that shows a reduction in traffic going along Kapiti Road. Is that right?
Yeah, from a daily point of view, not necessarily in the peak hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in peak hour. Okay. Right. Okay. And so, is there a reasonable expectation these links will happen? I mean, I've heard that the land is. I mean, they've been in place for a long time. And are they in the long-term planning for the council?
The link from Ihakra Street to Arafota Road, which is shown on page 12 of my evidence in figure 3.1, that's got some allocation of funding to it in the long-term plan, and there's business cases in train. There's been some business cases carried out previously. There's funding approved for the next stage of the business case, and then there's funding in the long-term plan for construction of that at some point in the future. I can't remember exactly what year. The other wider links and connections shown on figure 3.2 on page 13 of my evidence, that's more a estimation of what might happen in the future with the airport land and as it develops. And obviously when we're building the model, we try and make an estimation of what might happen in the future so we can understand the wider effects on the network. But none of those links have got any funding allocated to them. As a council, we'd probably wait for development to happen to try and secure those links rather than go and build them ourselves, because that would be a significant investment. And as Mr. Goldsmith pointed out, we have identified the connection as a long-term desire of the council for the notional road in the district plan, but as at this stage, there's no long-term plans for us to build those and fund those ourselves.
Okay, so just trying to understand the effects of this application in the shorter term rather than 2036 and even, I guess, even 2026. The data you presented on page 4 in those tables shows it dropping into the future. Presumably, when these links the roading improvements all been done, the new links and so forth, but there's a substantial amount of time between now and then, isn't there, until those are built? Yep. So I guess you heard Mr. Nixon's discussion about he's relying on 2018 data. And is that the council's position? Because you've essentially asked Mr. Kelly to assume at least a nil growth rate, and certainly not a negative growth rate. Have you had cause to reflect on whether a zero growth rate is appropriate, or whether there should be some allowance for some growth in the network based on the economics assessments which show increased activity, the transmission gully and the medium density legislation, all those sorts of factors. I know they're probably more planning issues, but from a traffic engineering perspective, do you think it's prudent to use a 0% growth rate in the short term?
I suppose at the time when we were looking at this, we were trying to, in effect, do a sensitivity test. Yes. Assume there was no growth. It's not ideal, and normally you would apply positive growth to the test. The SIDRA model itself probably is overestimating some of the effects as well, because you're looking at a peak within a peak in effect when the SIDRA model's modelling this. They're taking hourly flows and then pushing that into a peak within that peak and running the model. So there's a lot of, and my concern was there's a lot going on that network, and just that level of uncertainty. And I couldn't put a stake in the ground of what should be the ideal growth assessment. Where do you stop it? Is it 1%? Is it 2%? Is it 10%? Minus 4%? There's nothing really to pin that on. So I thought a prudent approach would be, let's see what happens if it doesn't move. Identified an effect. Tim ran the model to see if he could mitigate that. Found that there was something that would mitigate that effect. Hasn't been designed, I acknowledge, or looked at in any detail. But I thought if we monitor that and deal with that at a later date if it becomes apparent. And the other thing that it's quite complicated traffic modelling. You can never put a finger on the exact outcome. All those effects about people doing different things, different driver behaviours, traffic coming off certain other areas and going on other parts of the network. There could be some reduction in traffic on Kapiti Road for people who are going in countdown and then just going back home again. It's all these unknowns, and I think it would, from my point of view, it was better to just look at that once the store was open. Right. Okay. Yes, we've had a lot of discussion about that just very recently with legal submissions and the like about whether you should deal with your effects now, even though you don't know exactly what they might be, or
to use the colloquial term, kick the can down the road, which probably isn't quite fair because there is a suggestion put forward as to how to deal with effects by monitoring and bringing that forward to 1 year and so on. You were clearly happy with that approach, what might be called the adaptive management approach. Have you, Mr. Trotter, have you got any experience in dealing with similar situations elsewhere where mitigation works are dealt with later on down the track after review? Is that something you've been involved in?
Only in a very limited way. In effect, with parking outside a medical centre in Waikanae, we basically had a monitoring condition. If the parking spilled over onto the road network, then there would be mitigation in forms of parking control. So not to this degree, but yeah, just that type of experience of a low level monitoring.
At a low level scale, okay.
Yeah.
All right, and so just to confirm, I think you might have touched on this. You haven't seen a detail, or you haven't seen even a concept plan for mitigation works for a left turn lane, additional left turn lane on Kapiti Road leading into the site. You haven't. But is it your sort of expectation that it could be done because there's land there for it, and it could be designed depending on where the traffic is? If traffic was at 0%, you're confident it could be done. But have you turned your mind to whether it could be done if it was a higher traffic rate, or you simply can't answer it because you haven't seen the detail?
I do think that when Tim did his modelling, without having seen exactly what he modelled to any degree of detail, it did result in a level of service AB, which gave me some confidence that if we're aiming for a level of service D, that there should be scope in there for some movement in terms of traffic. It would allow for some growth, but I can't say what that would be.
Okay, all right. Sorry, I'll just see if I have any other. Is there anything else you'd like to address me on, or in terms of what you've heard?
Just on the issue of that improvement, as Mr. Nixon said, I would assume it would be a left turn lane only, so it wouldn't be a through lane, and therefore you could design it without the worry about the deflection being too much affected. That's where Mr. Carr was talking about how vehicles have to deflect around the object or drive around the object, which is how you try to design roundabouts to slow the traffic down to a safe speed. So I don't think that would be a safety problem with a left-only traffic lane.
Okay, and just while we're talking about the mitigation, the discussion about the longer left turn lane at the roundabout at Friendship Place, Mr. Nixon offered a comment that it may or may not pass a safety audit, but he thought it might get through, but it's unfair for me to get a definitive answer from him on that. Are you able to offer any comment on that, or would you need to do some detailed work on that as well to offer advice on whether a longer lane would be required for safety purposes?
I don't think it would be required for safety purposes. I agree with Mr. Nixon, it probably would come up as maybe a minor issue on a safety audit, but it wouldn't be something that I'd be unduly concerned of from a safety point of view. Okay,
no, that's useful because that has a potential land requirement implication if it was required. So it would become quite important to a consent. All right. I think I've got no further questions at this stage. So what, folks, if there's nothing else, we'll take a 5-minute break to allow me just to collect my thoughts on where we're at with the process, and then I'll come back. And we'll conclude the hearing at that point. So take a short 5-minute break. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, welcome back to those who are still with us. Thank you for persevering. I just took a brief break just to reflect on what I've heard and try and decide a way forward with the hearing. What is clear is that I'll be adjourning the hearing. It's a given, and I'm going to be considering what the next action points are, but it might be useful just to canvass what my initial thoughts are, or some of the considerations I will have to have before I issue a minute to direct people on this. But some of the things that have emerged during the hearing are pretty clear that differences of opinion about traffic growth on the network, uncertainties and the like, and whether the application is lodged has taken a realistic approach to traffic growth, if there is to be any. And because there have been no plans drawn up of mitigation works in any detail, there is some uncertainty about whether that could happen under different growth scenarios, including zero growth, I guess. So I'll be looking for more information on that, or more detail. And obviously that's something the parties I'd be interested in their views on plans that were drawn up. So that's just a first comment. The second one was to do with the expectations of growth within Kapiti landing site and what's reasonable to take on board with any assessments to design mitigation works for this proposal. And that includes whether there is in fact permitted development. I've heard from Ms. Ryden that there might be some uncertainty about the extent of what is in fact permitted there. So I'll need some information on that from Ms. Ryden. And whether controlled activity developments should be included in the assessment. Now that's a planning / legal matter, and I have to turn my mind to whether I ask either or both professions to address that issue, but it clearly is important before we get to the design stage, or before the applicant comes to designing specific works on the roadway. And an associated aspect is what growth might occur from wider developments, including the medium density legislation, the transmission gully, the links on the network, and those sorts of things. So those things are clearly also important to mitigation works that might be offered. And then, of course, I must acknowledge that the applicant has the right of reply and can take a position if they wish that they have done enough work, and that the condition that they've offered will address those effects. So I'm not denigrating the applicant's right of reply to resolve to wrap up the hearing at the end either. So all of those are the valid considerations that I'm mulling over at the moment. And I am conscious also that Mr. Quinn and others may have mentioned that they don't have planners engaged, and so there might be some caution about instructing planners to enter into a joint witness statement. But I'll be interested to hear from the parties as to how the planning side of it could take place, because clearly the traffic engineers will need some guidance on what sort of growth, if any, they should be aware of when they're doing their modelling. Sorry, that's a bit rambly, but I thought it'd be useful to get any feedback at this point before I go away and issue a minute on this. So if anyone wants to offer, perhaps Mr. Leakey, you haven't spoken for a while, perhaps if there's anything you'd like to make, any observations you'd like to make that others can then comment on what I've just gone through, I'd appreciate that.
Yes, thank you, sir. And I have made a few notes, and you've touched on one already, which is ultimately the applicant's case is the approach taken is appropriate in addressing effects and is legally valid. But in saying that, we are open and have an open mind to sort of a next steps type approach to look at the points you've raised. My sort of initial reactions, just listening to your thoughts there, for what they're worth, there may be some merit in sorry, I'll go back a step. In my submission, it seems possible that planners could potentially come to an agreement as to what are permitted and controlled and restricted discretionary activities within Kapiti Landing as a separate process or separate question to the more legal question, in my view, which is what relevance does a controlled or restricted discretionary activity have to the receiving environment? I've got some reluctance to throw that question certainly to the traffic engineers. Yeah. And if I heard them correctly, I think there was a common reluctance from all of them for that. And I do have some reluctance as enjoyable as I'm sure it would be for the lawyers to conference on that point. And that I think there's a clear difference of legal interpretation on what forms part of that legal receiving environment in terms of a controlled or restricted discretionary activity. But that's not to say we couldn't get some more clarity on what those activities are. An example is the high traffic generator rule that hasn't come up much today. Does have some relevance as to the future consenting requirements of activities at Kapiti landing.
Yes.
But that could be a planning point. Likewise, well, I don't have a closed mind to it, and ultimately it's a call for the Commissioner. Listening to the Council, I have some concerns over how much we can dig into the model and the assumptions made in the model. But a potential alternative way to skin that cat, for want of a better term, maybe to consider the sensitivity testing applied to the growth rates as an alternative approach to testing the outputs of that model. And that's potentially a traffic engineering. So I've put that on my could potentially go type list. And then my last thought, just in terms of responding to your initial thoughts there, was a sensible, or would seem sensible, work stream would be around this northwest approach mitigation as to what it could look like. It was a common message from Mr. Nixon and Mr. Carr that their concerns were around, well, we just don't know what it looks like. And we've heard that. So that would be in the traffic engineer camp. So they're that was sort of my initial thoughts on
thanks
for the next steps.
Thanks for that, Mr. Leakey. And in terms of that last point, what I was thinking was that would the traffic engineers be able to design something? Would it be a sensitivity-based design based on growth rates being 0 and 10, 1%, 2%, whatever? Because I was imagining that the earlier work that's done by the planners and that would assist them. But are you saying that you think they could do some work anyway ahead of that?
Well, I think Mr. Kelly could do some work ahead of that to make it most efficient, perhaps, rather than go in with a blank page to then essentially be tested or peer reviewed through in a conferencing sort of format. I think just while I'm holding the talking stick before I mute myself, and it's a matter for closing legal subs, but just to clarify a point that I suspect isn't a point of difference as between legal counsel that is. In my submission, the permitted baseline, so the 104 type permitted baseline, the relevance of that is in terms of assessing the effects of this application. So what activities on this site in the general industrial zone could generate an effect, and in my submission, they should be disregarded. I put that in a category over here, quite separate to the questions raised through the hearing on what is the nature of the receiving environment. So the environment against which we should be assessing effect.
That's right, but we haven't had any discussion or assessment of the permitted baseline on this site, have we? In terms of
no, and I don't think it's a particularly major point, and that it's not a point that has that much turns on the actual on-site permitted baseline. It's more relevant in terms of what the policy regime anticipates in an amenity sense of this site, which is quite an unrelated matter to traffic, which has been the focus today.
Yes, okay, that's fine. That's useful. I probably, in hindsight, I probably should have asked you to, before I raised anything else, was to say, are you prepared to offer anything based on what you heard at the hearing? Are you prepared to offer any work before I direct it in terms of, you did mention the plans which people have asked for to show the mitigation. Is that something you'd agree to? You're prepared to offer up as part of the application?
It's something that I'd need to take instructions on. I mean, and what I've just gone over there are my views on what would assist the Commissioner in getting through the points that have been raised, and that would include some work around what that mitigation the northwest approach looks like. So I suspect I would be able to get instructions that is something that the applicant would be willing to offer up, but I'd appreciate a bit of time to get those instructions, which may align with your time to write the minute.
Well, that's right. So I think that's a good way forward, because it's really, you have the right of reply, I guess, but which normally comes in writing at the end of the process. But this is your chance to respond to things you've heard today as well, if you wish to. Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I'll make a note of that you might take instructions on that. All right. Well, that's most useful to me. And in terms of the other council, Mr. Goldsmith, if you're still there, you've been pretty clear on this anyway. You've provided legal submissions, and you've even suggested a joint witness statement, or at least a way forward in terms of the points you've outlined in your legal submissions. Is there anything else you wanted to say on that while I've got you on the line?
Just, Commissioner, one issue which you touched on and Mr. Leakey touched on, the issue essentially raised in my submission about the relevance of the Controlled Act.
Yeah.
I agree that it's for the planners to express a view as to what is controlled or what is permitted. I mean, that would be a starting point.
Yes.
But then the issue of what is the relevance of, in terms of Friendship Place and traffic and growth on Friendship Place, whether or not the permitted controlled activity development in the airport zone is a relevant consideration, I think is a legal issue. I don't think it's something that, I mean, the two of us haven't got planners yet. It isn't a planning issue. It isn't a traffic engineer issue. It's a legal issue.
I think Mr. Leakey agreed with you on that. I think he said that the planners would just be asked to provide a factual statement.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I think I agree with Mr. Leakey that a lawyer's conference doesn't sound like it's going to produce a result. But who knows? I'm just not sure. So I think probably, and you did ask me to record in writing my response to Mr. Leakey on that point.
Yes, that's right.
It may be that, and I think Mr. Quinn sat on the fence. One more time to think about it. So it may be on that one issue, there's a direction that on that one issue may be one that you have to rule on. I mean, if I give a submission saying one thing, and Mr. Leakey gives a submission saying something else, and Mr. Quinn goes one way or the other, if we can't agree, it would be something you would have to decide which way to go.
Oh, absolutely. I don't necessarily expect consensus on all matters, that's for sure. Yeah.
Unless you've decided to then give another opinion.
Well,
I'm saying that particular issue, I think, is one where perhaps the direction that I looked at some submissions, Mr. Quinn looked at some submissions, Mr. Leakey has a right of reply. And if we can't agree, then it's a matter that will have to be determined by the Commission.
Yes. Okay. So you're suggesting a sort of iterative approach where
if that issue has to be, it depends whether the traffic experts either have to model both, kind of with or without, so two different modelling, or they're going to have to be directed which one
to use. Yeah.
And I think the legal submissions probably have to precede that. So on that issue, I might have to make a submission to Mr. Quinn and Mr. Leakey, and then you might need to decide whether you're going to go one way or the other and issue a direction to the traffic experts.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
Or whether you ask the traffic experts to do both.
To do both, yeah, that's right. The way that's the dilemma I have, and I did hear Mr. Leakey say that he will take instructions, but he might ask Mr. Kelly to do some initial work anyway to see. It'll be interesting to see what the sensitivity shows for even a much higher growth rate, to see how that stacks up, But I think it would be useful to help guide the traffic engineers as much as can be done. That's for sure.
I certainly agree, sir, and I've hopefully given a strong enough view that I think that would be a good idea as well, and that it may answer some of the other questions or make them less relevant, perhaps.
Well, that's right, and let's not make work for ourselves if it's not necessary. So yeah, absolutely. All right, no, I'm finding this useful. I'm sitting sole on this hearing. I don't have other panel members to discuss things with, so I do appreciate the feedback you're all giving me. So thank you for that, Mr. Quinn.
Sarah, I can be very brief. I agree with the approach of Mr. Goldsmith on this. I think the sequence is important.
Yes.
First step in the sequence is the planners, and I agree that can be limited to confirming the relevant permitted and controlled activities.
Yes.
It's noted that there are only 2 planners so far involved.
That's right. Yeah.
From my client's perspective, we can engage a planner to be available at short notice and be involved in that limited exercise just to get a sense of balance or a cross check to that.
Yes.
But that is certainly step 1. Step 2 is the approach in terms of the legal aspect, which I think goes beyond what we should be asking the planners or the traffic engineers to do. And I think my friend's approach in terms of there being a sequence of submissions being submitted would be useful. And then it's linking that into the conferencing and direction in terms of the traffic engineers. And it may be, to the extent there's still a difference in terms of that legal position, the modelling just needs to reflect those different
things,
so that's before you as a matter of evidence.
Okay, that's useful. And in the meantime, that wouldn't preclude the applicant from doing whatever work they feel is necessary in terms of potential designs and, to keep things moving, I guess. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Look, I think I've talked to everyone. That seems very useful feedback. I'll reflect on all of that and issue a minute in due course on that. So thank you very much for that. And just to record that there are some matters I've asked for further comment from legal submissions, just to add to some of the legal submissions. If they can be sent in before I issue my minute, that would be useful. In terms of the planner's reply report, I think we can possibly park that for now, but Ms. Ryden, you'll probably be asked to get involved in some work there on a specific aspect of it. So we'll leave that for the moment. That's it. I think that's all I can.
I'm sorry, so I didn't quite understand. You mentioned then about legal submissions being issued before you issue a minute. I anticipated that your minute would issue directions.
Oh, sorry. No, what I meant by that, I should have explained that. But it's just you sending me written notes on things you presented today. That's all I meant by that. Remember, I asked you to send me a note on some legal submissions, and also I think Mr. Quinn asked him to send me something as well. It's purely just to write down in writing the things you've said today verbally.
The only thing you asked me to give you a note on is this issue of the relevance of the control.
Oh, which is the point you're okay. Sorry,
yes.
You're right. Okay, you won't need to.
I assume you're going to issue directions on that. That's the point you asked me. Yes.
Yep, you're right. Sorry, it's been a long day. And in terms of the sequence, do the council have any suggestions about who should go first with those things? Because I suppose that you're better to be the one who goes last.
I'm happy to go first. I think Mr. Quinn should go second, and Mr. Leckie is entitled to a right of reply.
Yeah, okay. We'll do it. Yep.
And of course, in the course of that, and having got that,
yep,
it's also open to the Commission possibly to seek a legal opinion from the council's lawyers.
Well, that's right. Yes, we'll see what comes out of it. Okay. No, look, I do appreciate that open discussion that we've all had. So it does help me. And it's clearly a very important matter and not to be taken lightly. And we have to cover all avenues and do it the right way. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And I'll adjourn the hearing forthwith and wait for a minute to be issued in due course. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.